Now, this past week, we have been diverted from the war in Iraq. Our focus has shifted from Baghdad to New Orleans. And the enemy arrived. The enemy obviously was nature. And it arrived with this terrible hurricane. But there may be other enemies, I don't know. This flood, this horrible flood, the greatest catastrophe most likely in terms of nature in the history of the United States of America, is still playing itself out. And what we know is that there are thousands of people who bear long or maybe short grievances against the process that was used in terms of their rescue. I intend in November to do a whole series on cities that experience great disasters, from New Orleans to Galveston to San Francisco to Hiroshima, whatever, whether natural or unnatural, and to see how people responded to the disaster. I would do it in October, but nobody lets me know in advance what is going to happen, so I'm scheduled through September and October. But the diversion doesn't make the crisis in Iraq any better. Our minds are taken away from it for a while, and the newspaper headlines no longer feature the killings in Iraq, but it's there, it's persistent, and we have this war in Iraq, and now the special crisis is, where are we going to find the money to pay not only for rebuilding New Orleans, all right, which is a national responsibility, all right, and rescuing all these people and maintaining them and housing them and feeding them and whatever else is involved, and simultaneously pay a cost or pay the cost of a war that doesn't seem to be ending. In fact, it's continuing, and I want to somehow explain very, very clearly what our options are, what the dilemma is. There are many problems in the war. Okay, I mean, the first and main problem is that there are thousands and thousands of people in Iraq who may have been Iraqi or who may have come from outside Iraq. It's irrelevant. They've got guns and bombs, and they are engaged in a major rebellion against the American forces that are there and the government of Iraq, which was created by the Americans after the invasion. Right? So wherever they came from, it doesn't make any difference. They're there, and they're running around, and they're shooting, and they're bombing, and they're killing. And there isn't a day in which there are not American casualties, and in which there are not dozens, if not hundreds, of Iraqi casualties. I mean, it's the insurgency. And most of the insurgency seems to be coming from the middle of the country, or the north, where 20% of the population, called the Sunni Arabs, live. All right? That seems to be the center. There are other areas of provocation, but that seems to be the main area of provocation. The second problem, I mean, obviously, is the bloodshed. If we didn't have television, you have to understand how television has altered war. It started with the Vietnam War. The whole story of the Vietnam War would have been different without television. People sit in their living rooms or in their kitchens or wherever they're watching TV, and they can see the blood. Oh, what is this? I believe this. I thought I turned it off. This is La Traviata. I have good taste. They can see it. I mean, you're sitting in your kitchen, your living room, and there it is. and it becomes intolerable. When it's not visual, when it's simply a description, a line, do you understand, in a newspaper, it may be tolerable. The nature of the media makes this kind of continuing warfare intolerable. I mean, it's like the flood in New Orleans. If we had no images, right? If there were no visuals attached to it, if it was simply what? Descriptions in a newspaper, then the impact would be entirely, it's all the visuals. And nobody can conduct war now without realizing the impact of television. The Vietnam War came to an end when it came to an end, and the American people withdrew because the images, do you understand? The images of the bloodshed were absolutely intolerable. And then we have the losses. Every day there are American soldiers who are killed. Initially, in the euphoria of the invasion, it seemed to be part of a triumphant entry into the country. But now, without any foreseeable end to the war, people are asking questions. Even people who formerly supported the war, the question is, so why are they dying? Should we expose our soldiers to that continuous provocation if there is no positive benefit that will result? And some of the early hype and propaganda now seems a little tired. I mean, it doesn't seem to have the same force or power. One of the major challenges is that we said we were leaving when we created an Iraqi army that could replace us. An army that did not belong to Saddam Hussein. It would be an army representing democratic Iraq. So we've been working at it. I mean, if you want to talk about casualties, the major losses are not American losses. They are losses to the Iraqi army. Every recruiting station gets what? Bombed every other day. The major targets of the insurgents are the Iraqis who sign up for what they call the American army. So we do not presently have an Iraqi army that we can leave in charge of the country unless we wish to lose whatever gains were achieved by the American arrival. Every day we hear they're ready. They're getting ready. They're about to be ready, but they're not quite ready. They're not quite ready. So when will they be ready? Estimates that have been made by the military of the United States, many officers of which have been shut up by the government because they spoke inappropriately. I mean, we could be there till 2009 or 2010 before this army would be feasible, and it's not clear even then that it would be feasible. One of the problems is that we have an insufficient number of American troops there to maintain law and order. If we had double the troops, we most likely would be able to subdue most of the insurgency. We don't have enough troops, and we don't have any more to send. I mean, if we're going to pick up more, what National Guards are left? We don't have enough to take care of the flood in New Orleans. And nobody's signing up. I don't know why. By the way, if you have patriotic fervor and there's the image of success, then you can get people to sign up. But in the present stalemate, getting recruits is almost impossible. The major parts of the population that we turn to are the people who need jobs. So they're the poor. They are overwhelmingly overrepresented in what we call the armed forces. Whether the blacks or the Hispanics, whatever they are, there they are. The children of the northern white bourgeoisie are generally not there. There are some, but percentage-wise it doesn't correspond to the percentage of people in what I call the northern white bourgeoisie. Southern whites tend to be more interested in the army than northern whites. But blacks and Hispanics, and they, who in many cases need jobs, Why would they sign up for death? Obviously, if the enemy were invading the shores of the United States of America, we would have what? I mean, there would be patriotic fervor. Then there's the cost. We've cut taxes. There are further talks about cutting more taxes. I heard on the radio somebody complaining who was promoting eliminating totally and absolutely all estate taxes. And they were crushed by the flood, because now it's impossible to talk about cutting taxes, because who's going to pay for rebuilding New Orleans? So the cost is overwhelming. The deficit is going crazy. It's the kind of deficit that Republicans used to accuse Democrats of creating. And then there's the religious problem. The proposal of the United States of America with regard to Iraq was that what would be created would be a democratic Iraq. Now, what we mean by democracy, and this is always the problem, what we mean by democracy is not merely majority rule. What we mean by democracy is personal freedom as well. And in fact, personal freedom places a limitation on majority rule. The majority doesn't have the right to tell you how to dress, whom to worship, where to worship, what work to do. I mean, this is your personal choice. But in Iraq, democracy means something else. If you're a fundamentalist, democracy means that the fundamentalist majority has the right to impose its lifestyle, isn't that democratic? To impose its lifestyle on the minority. So if there are women running around without a head covering, right, there is no Bill of Rights to guarantee that they can do what they want to do, walk around without the head covering. Even if it's a law, there is no force or power that is willing to enforce it. And the power of fundamentalist public opinion means that women in Iraq, who 10 years ago walked around looking like Western women, are now covering their bodies from head to toe. There's no police to call. I mean, you can cite a law. What's cite a law? If nobody will enforce it, and if public opinion is against you. So now what we have discovered in democratic Iraq is that the people who are elected are clergymen who have very definite ideas on how everybody should behave. And in fact, they want democratically, through majority vote, to create institutions which will force anybody dealing with family affairs, that's your life, to go before clergy courts where the judges are all fundamentalists. Well, they say, but it's democratic. We voted on it. By the way, this confusion is the greatest confusion I know of with democracy. Majoritarian democracy all by itself is dangerous. Totally dangerous. It does not protect individuals because there's nothing crueler sometimes than public opinion. And it will not defend individuals at all. What made America great, it's what I call the essence of Anglo-Saxon and English democracy, was the granting of individual rights, which places the limit on the majority. But in Iraq, I mean, these fundamentalists are saying, well, we're winning the election, right? So now we have the right to what? To impose our will on everybody. One of the problems I alluded to last week, next door to Iraq is now an overconfident country rolling in oil money, which is fooling around with nuclear weapons. It's called Iran. And in fact, many of the leaders that showed up for the Constitutional Convention, many of the fundamentalist leaders of the Shiite world, spent years of exile under Saddam Hussein in Iran. And they're the ones drafting the Constitution. They're the ones whose friends are in Tehran. Certainly, one of the major challenges for the war is sustaining American public opinion to support it. Polls have indicated that the support for the war in Iraq has now gone under 50%. At one time, at the very beginning of the war, the president enjoyed wide support. For Afghanistan, it was like 85, 90, whatever, it was way, way up. And initially with Iraq, it was in the high 60s. Now, the support for the war is in the mid-40s and is sinking. So now the question becomes, in order to carry this on, after all, governments want to be reelected. How do you drum up the support? One of the major challenges was in this thing called drafting a constitution. An election was held to create a constitutional convention. The legislature in Iraq now is not the formal legislature, it's the constitutional convention, right? Which will create a constitution, and then on the basis of that constitution, an election will be held for a legislature. So this is the constitutional convention. They came together and the election was flawed. Of the three major groups in Iraq, only two fully participated. The Shiite Arabs, who are 60%, they are the majority of the people in Iraq. They participated. They hated Saddam Hussein. They initially welcomed the Americans. The Kurds in the north, who are not Arabs, they were protected by the Americans after the Gulf War, and they were enthusiastic about creating a new constitution. But the former rulers of Iraq, this group of people who represent 20% of the nation, the Sunni Arabs, on the whole abstained. Well, you say, so they abstained, so they don't have any representation in the convention, so they won't have any representation in the making of the Constitution. The point is, if 20% of your population is disaffected and they're rioting, saying, well, they're not a majority, what difference does it make? I mean, life becomes impossible. We can see that, right? You can see that in Iraq. So the absence of the Sunni Arabs in the determination of the Constitution has created a major problem in terms of creating a document that will work. What we have learned in America is, we call it minority rights, that you can't function if there are large minorities who are opposed to what you decide. They will cause trouble. So we ultimately dealt with the black issue, not necessarily satisfactorily, with the Hispanic, right, issue. See, the fundamental problem in Iraq, which makes the creation of a constitution that will work almost impossible, is that this state, which was created in terms of its borders by the British in 1919, has within it three nations. It is not true that territorial boundaries define a nation. It defines a state. So Canada is a state. The people in Quebec do not see themselves as part of the same nation as the people in Ontario. They see themselves as members of the French Canadian, Quebecois nation, who are citizens, if you will, of the state of Canada. In Spain, the Basques do not consider themselves to be Spanish. They are Basque. They are citizens of Spain, and their passports, got it, says Spain, but they are not of Spanish nationality. There is a distinction between nationality and citizenship. We don't use it in America because it's a very touchy subject. Most people who are American, the majority, did not belong to what we call the founding race of America. The founding race of America are the Anglo-Saxons. And when I was a child, they were only called Americans. All other Americans had hyphens. Jewish Americans, Irish Americans, Italian Americans. There was always a hyphen to sort of emphasize the fact that they weren't originally part of what we call the founding race. But in America, people have been assimilated to what we call the secular political structure. But in most nations of the world, or states of the world, that isn't true. So there are three nations, got it, living in one state. And what has kept that state together, I'll spell it for you. There are two ways of spelling. I'll do it the short way. O-I-L.
P-E-T-I.
No. The other one takes too long to spell. O-I-L. That's what keeps it together. That is, nobody wants to leave the state because the oil is either in the far south or the far north. If you leave the state, especially if you live in the middle, you have no O-I-L and the money that comes from it. I mean, that's what keeps a country like Nigeria going. Do you remember the civil war that occurred back in the 70s when a group of people called the Igbos, a nation within Nigeria, rebelled where all the oil was and declared their independence and said, we're Biafra? And they had all the oil. Was Nigeria prepared to allow these people to declare their independence? If there was no oil, they would have said, okay. Couldn't. So they're sort of tied together, but they hate each other. And the hatreds are sometimes as intense or more intense than the hatreds that exist between French Canadians that pops up from time to time and English Canadians, the hatred of Basques for the Spanish oppressors who tried to control, I mean, all of these things. So, what I want to do now is to tell you the story of each of these nations, because that isn't always clarified in the information that we get. We say Iraqi. Well, Iraqi is like a geographic term, right? There are three nations there. So I'm going to start with the most numerous, with the Shiites. They are Shiite Arabs. And in fact, you would say, well, they belong to the same nation as the Sunni Arabs. Wrong. If religion is not important to you, I mean, if you're a secular Arab, then what? Doesn't make any difference. But if religion is overwhelmingly important to you, then there is this incredible division. We have it in Yugoslavia. The Serbs and the Croats speak almost the same language, but historically, I turned that on. Historically, the two peoples, they have a common origin, and their languages are almost identical. But the Serbs historically were Greek Orthodox, and the Croats were Roman Catholic, and in fact, that religious difference, given the intensity of feeling, created two separate nations. So, Let's talk about the Shiite Arabs. The land of Iraq used to be called by the Greeks Mesopotamia. It was a country filled with many nations. There were the Sumerians and the Babylonians and the Assyrians, and then came the Persians, and then came the Greeks, and then came the Romans, and then came the Arabs, all right? When the Arabs came to Mesopotamia, they gave it a name, an Arabic name. It did not have before. It was around for thousands of years as a civilization without the name Iraq. The Arabs gave it the name Iraq. They conquered it. They were a small minority who now conquered all these people. And they brought with them a very intense religion called Islam. And they proceeded to convert the people of Mesopotamia to Islam. Now, theoretically, once you become a Muslim, you should be treated equally with all original Muslims. But that is not what happened. The ruling Arab dynasty that followed Muhammad was a dynasty called the Umayyads. The Umayyads' capital was not in Iraq, it was in Syria, in Damascus. And they were Arab chauvinists. So they made a very clear distinction between the rights of Arab Muslims and converts. So the converts were mad. There were thousands Mesopotamia. Their original language, before they ultimately began to speak Arabic, was Aramaic, another Semitic language. And, in fact, that language can still be heard in the churches of the Chaldeans, who come from Mesopotamia but are not of Arab origin. They are of Aramaic origin, of Chaldean origin, the people who were there before the Arabs ever got there. But thousands and hundreds of thousands of Chaldeans and Arameans and whatever are converted to Islam. And they expect equality, but they don't get it. So they find a champion who says to them, if you put me in charge, you'll be treated equally. That champion was the son-in-law of Muhammad, who was married to his daughter Fatima. His name was Ali. And he now stood up against the Umayyads, who when he dies, an election is held, and Ali becomes the Caliph. So the people in Iraq, the converts, are what? Overjoyed. In 656, in 600 over. So the followers of Ali, who are called the Shi'at Ali, the party of Ali, refuse, however, to give up. And even after he is killed, and even after the enemy takes over, they create of But they were not lucky. From the very beginning, they were persecuted. Gods, and after the they persecuted the Shiites. So the Shiites developed a culture, and I want to if you visit the Shiite shrines or they were Chaldeans. By